This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work with another response to an AskProfWolff question sent in by our Patreon community, and in this case by a member of that community, Jordan. Jordan asks an interesting question about China, and in particular about the way the Chinese like to describe their system. Quote, socialism with Chinese characteristics. And Jordan asks me to go into what that means and what that is and how it differs from other kinds of socialism with other characteristics other than Chinese. To explain this, you need to go back and know something about China, and particularly about China's relationship to what was, at the time the Chinese made their revolution back in 1949, when they completed a civil war, basically, a war that they won to establish modern communism in China as it was then called. I should be careful to explain that using the word communism is itself problematic. The Chinese, like the Russians, have always referred to the Soviet Union and to the People's Republic of China as quote-unquote socialist societies. Communism was the name of their political party that was in power, but it was not the name of their system. Communism was something that would come in the future. The role of the Communist Party was to establish socialism and then to guide that socialism to another stage, another system called communism. People lose sight of that. They shouldn't, because what the Russians had until 1989 in the Soviet Union and what the Chinese communists, and that's the way they call their party, what they have in China to this day is socialism, not, or at least not yet, communism. So let's go back. Socialism with Chinese characteristics. Well, the great model for China in 1949, when they began to construct Chinese socialism, having won the Civil War in China at that time, the big model for them was the Soviet Union, which had helped them to make their revolution, helped them win the Civil War, helped them in countless ways. But the Chinese knew that their culture, their history was different from that of Russia, and that sooner or later they would probably have some important differences. Well, it didn't take long, literally 11 years, between 1949, when the Mao Zedong government took over in China, and 1960, a mere 11 years, that was enough. In 1960, basically, Russia and China broke off their solidarity and their friendly relationships and became quite critical of one another at various kinds of intensity. The Chinese wanted to go in different directions. They had already done that in the 1950s by trying to set up communes on a mass social scale. Communes are a step towards that communism. Russia had not done anything like what the Chinese did. The Chinese didn't stay with it very long. By 1960, it was already in decline. But it was already a hint that the Chinese would go their own way. Well, to make a long history short and condensed, what the Chinese did different from Russia, the most important two things were: one, they did not insist on keeping their economy a totally government-owned and operated economy. They just didn't do it. Partly the reason the Soviets did it was forced on them. The rest of the world treated them as a pariah. But the treatment of China wasn't all that different. But the Chinese made a strategic decision over the last 50 years. They were going to open their economy to allow private enterprise, organized and started and run by Chinese citizens, but also, particularly after the 1980s, to allow foreign private capitalist enterprises, Japanese, European, American, to establish private enterprises. The Chinese government would retain final power and authority. The Chinese Communist Party would be the dominant, exclusive owner of political power over both the private and the government sectors. The government kept some industry under its own control. It is a highly organized, top-down economic system, but it allows private enterprise on a scale never seen by the Soviet Union. So one thing that's unique about Chinese socialism is its allowance for a very large private capitalist sector. The second thing that distinguishes the Chinese brand of socialism was a reliance on exports. Most revolutions by socialists involved taking over governments, reorganizing societies that were inward-looking, that were not focused on exports, largely because the rest of the world didn't want to help these countries succeed, wanted in a way to choke them, and so would not buy the products they had to sell, so they had to turn in on themselves and kind of make it without being part of the world economy. That meant an enormous reliance on the few other countries that would trade with them, like Russia, Soviet Russia, and so on. You can see the difference because, like Russia, Vietnam, Cuba, and other countries that went in that direction became self-sufficient to an extraordinary degree and or reliant on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The Chinese would not do that. They became focused on international trade with everybody. You might say that the strategy of socialism in China was to become the manufacturing center for the whole world, to build a socialism with a reliance on exports, something that other socialists probably couldn't have done if they had wanted to, but ended up really not wanting to, in the sense of not trying very hard to go in that direction. So China became very unique in its kind of socialism, its opening to allow the coexistence of private capitalism in big, major parts of the economy, and in its engagement with the world economy, both of those things giving China a much greater grasp of the rest of the world, a more integrated understanding of the rest of the world because of the constant back and forth interactions between China and the rest of the world, whereas Soviet Russia, Vietnam, Cuba, and so on were heavily cut off from the rest of the world. I think those are the basic qualities, and that make the Chinese different from the North Koreans and from many others, including their model, the Soviet Union. The interesting thing was that those two strategic decisions of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party to allow private enterprise to coexist and to be engaged in international trade, those two things proved in the last decades of the 20th century to give China an opportunity to achieve even more rapid economic development than Russia had achieved during its Soviet period, making Russia and China the two fastest growing global economies, Russia in the 20th century and China in the 21st. In hopes this has responded to your question, Jordan, thanks for sending it, and thanks, of course, to our Patreon community for all their support.